500,000 fans crashed the French Open, and Eala hadn't even played yet. On April 22, 2026, Roland Garros opened its last-minute ticket portal. What followed wasn't excitement, it was chaos in the most literal sense. Around 500,000 fans rushed the site simultaneously, overwhelming the official French Open servers within seconds. The system didn't slow down, it collapsed completely. Before a single ball had been struck in Paris, before the draw was even released, before court assignments were announced, 500,000 people had already made their move, and the infrastructure built for one of the most prestigious tennis tournaments in the world simply wasn't ready for what they represented. Social media reacted instantly. Users began comparing the crash to the infamous Taylor Swift Ticketmaster disaster, not as hyperbole, but as pattern recognition. That 2022 meltdown had shaken the live events industry to its core, forcing congressional hearings and industry-wide reassessments of how demand is managed. Now, in 2026, tennis fans were invoking the same reference point. And the parallel wasn't just about server failures, it was about what a server failure signals, that the volume of people trying to access something has outpaced every system designed to handle it. What made this particular crash different and more significant is the context around the player at the center of it. Eala is ranked 38th in the world. She is 20 years old. She is not a defending Grand Slam champion. She had not been confirmed for a marquee court assignment. The draw had not been released. And yet, hundreds of thousands of people moved simultaneously, not in response to any official announcement, but simply in anticipation of her presence at Roland Garros. The ticket portal crash was not a random system failure. It was a data point, one that organizers, broadcasters, and scheduling committees are now being forced to interpret because the numbers make it impossible to ignore. When resale markets responded just as quickly, with VIP box seats for early round sessions reportedly climbing to $2,000, the crash stopped being a technical incident and became a commercial statement. This is the story of what happened in Paris in May 2026 and why it matters far beyond tennis. If you want to follow every development as it unfolds, the matchups, the court decisions, the moments that are rewriting what this sport looks like, subscribe to Pro Tennis 360. This is exactly where that conversation lives. The Taylor Swift comparison that tennis couldn't ignore. When fans began comparing the Roland Garros ticket crash to the Taylor Swift Ticketmaster collapse of 2022, the tennis world had two choices: dismiss it as fan exaggeration or take it seriously as a structural signal. The more the data came in, the harder dismissal became. The Taylor Swift comparison wasn't about celebrity equivalence, it was about demand architecture. In 2022, Ticketmaster systems buckled under the weight of Swifties, a fan base known for its intensity, its coordination, and its willingness to wait hours in virtual queues for a chance at tickets. The result was a public reckoning about how the live events industry manages surges of demand that exceed the assumptions built into its platforms. In Paris, the same logic applied, with one critical difference. Taylor Swift fans knew exactly which shows they wanted. Dates were confirmed, venues were set, tickets had been hyped for months. The demand wave, while massive, was conditioned by a clear schedule. The Roland Garros crash happened before any of those conditions existed. The draw had not been released, court assignments were unknown.
Nobody had confirmed which sessions Eala would play or where. The portal opened and 500,000 people flooded in anyway, unconditioned, uncoordinated, and completely overwhelming. That distinction matters. It means the demand wasn't responding to information. It was responding to the idea of presence. The mere possibility that Eala would be at Roland Garros was enough to trigger a demand event that crashed official infrastructure. Organizations were forced to implement emergency measures, a 30-minute browsing limit, a 15-minute cart timer, and mass queue expulsions as fans were pushed out of the system before completing purchases. These weren't minor adjustments. They were triage measures applied to a system that had been overwhelmed by an audience it hadn't accounted for. The broader conversation that followed, online, on tennis forums, in sports media, was less about the crash itself and more about what it represented. Grand Slam ticketing models were built around historical demand patterns, seedings, and draw-based anticipation. They were not built for a scenario where a world number 38 generates server-crashing demand before a single match is scheduled. That gap between design assumption and real-world behavior is now impossible to paper over. World number 38 and VIP tickets were selling for $2,000. Here is the number that reframes everything: $2,000. That is the reported resale price for VIP box seats during sessions where Alex Eala was expected to appear at Roland Garros 2026. Not for the final, not for a semifinal featuring the top 2 seeds. For early round matches, the kind that historically carried the lowest ticket prices in a Grand Slam draw. To understand why this is remarkable, it helps to understand how Grand Slam pricing normally works. Official pricing tiers are tied to round progression. Early rounds are priced to reflect lower demand. Later rounds command premiums because the competition and star power intensify. The secondary market typically mirrors this logic, with resale prices climbing as the tournament advances and top players remain in contention. What happened in Paris broke that model. Before the first round had even begun, before anyone knew whether Eala would advance beyond her opening match, secondary market prices for sessions involving her were already reaching levels typically associated with final week play. Brokers had identified her commercial pull and priced accordingly, not based on round of competition, but based on audience gravity. Her presence alone was the variable that moved the market. This is significant for multiple reasons. First, it indicates that the secondary market, which responds purely to demand signals rather than institutional tradition, had already processed something that official structures had not formally acknowledged. Second, it suggests that the audience willing to pay for Eala's matches is not a casual fan base. People who spend $2,000 on early round VIP seats are making a deliberate investment in a specific experience. Third, it creates an increasingly visible gap between what official ticket allocations reflect and what the actual market is expressing. That gap is now part of the public conversation. It isn't just fans complaining about prices. It's analysts and sports journalists pointing to resale data as evidence that the commercial architecture of Grand Slams is misaligned with current audience behavior. When a player ranked 38th in the world commands final week resale pricing in round 1, the question is no longer whether the market has recognized her. It clearly has. But whether the institutions governing the sport will adjust their frameworks accordingly.
She's seeded for the first time, and that changes everything. For the first time in her career at a Grand Slam, Alex Eala arrived at Roland Garros 2026 as a seeded player. That single fact carries more weight than it might initially appear. Seedings at a Grand Slam are not ceremonial, they are structural. A seeded player receives protection in the draw, meaning she cannot be placed against another top seed in the early rounds. Her ranking has become high enough that the tournament itself must accommodate her trajectory. She is no longer a qualifier hoping to avoid an opening round giant. She is, by formal classification, one of the players the draw is built around. For Eala, this transition is both a milestone and a shift in expectation. In 2021, she won the Roland Garros junior doubles title on these very courts, her first major mark in Paris as a teenager. That moment was notable, but contained within the junior draw, a separate world from the main event. Now, 5 years later, she returns to the same red clay as a seeded professional in the main draw of a Grand Slam that has 500,000 people crashing its ticketing system before the first ball is struck. The contrast between those two moments, teenage doubles champion and seeded professional commanding Grand Slam level attention, is not lost on those who have followed her development. It is being framed as confirmation of a trajectory that has been building steadily, even if the mainstream tennis conversation is only now catching up to it. What seeding also does, practically, is validate her presence in the elite structure of the sport. Rankings can rise and fall.
Seedings formalize where a player sits relative to the field at a given moment. When Roland Garros assigned her a seed, it was the tournament saying, in institutional language, that her ranking demands structural protection. That is a different category from being a promising young player. It is recognition from the sport's own architecture. And that recognition arrived at precisely the moment when external attention, from fans, from ticket markets, from media, was already treating her like a headliner. The seeding didn't create the demand, but it confirmed, officially, what the market had already priced in. Jovic in round 1, a match with quarterfinal energy. If Eala's first-round opponent had been a qualifier or a player outside the top 50, the opening match might have been framed as a straightforward opportunity. A chance to settle into the tournament, find rhythm on clay, and build momentum. That is not the scenario Roland Garros delivered. Her first-round draw, Eala Jovic, world number 17, 18 years old. A teenage prodigy who reached the Australian Open quarterfinals in January 2026, becoming the youngest American to achieve that result since Venus Williams in 1998. This is not a warm-up match. It is a first-round contest with the competitive profile of a quarterfinal. Jovic's Australian Open run wasn't a fluke. She defeated several ranked opponents en route to the final 8. Playing a brand of tennis, aggressive from the baseline, physically imposing for her age, that had earned her recognition as one of the most promising young players on tour. By the time Roland Garros began, she was firmly established as a top 20 player and someone with a genuine claim to deep runs at majors. For Eala, this draw meant that there would be no gradual warm-up to the tournament. The first match would require full competitive intensity, against an opponent who had already demonstrated she belongs in the second week of Grand Slams. And that context intensified the stakes further because the ticket market had already priced the match as if it were a headliner event, with resale prices for sessions involving Eala reaching into the 4-figure range before the draw was even confirmed. What emerged was an unusual situation in tennis, a first-round women's singles match carrying demand signals, ticket pricing, and media attention typically associated with much later stages of a major. The sport's usual frameworks, where early-round matches are treated as preliminary and relatively low stakes in commercial terms, simply didn't apply. The players entering court for that first-round match were doing so with an audience expectation more commonly associated with finals week. That mismatch between round designation and actual stakes is part of what makes the 2026 Roland Garros moment feel structurally different from any previous chapter in women's tennis. Practice court 4, and 3 rows of fans deep. 2 days before her first match, on May 22, 2026, Eala walked out to Court 4 at Roland Garros for a morning practice session. Court 4 is not a stadium court. It is not a broadcast centerpiece. It is the kind of venue typically reserved for lower-profile practice activity, a space where players warm up away from the main event atmosphere, hitting ground strokes without cameras, without crowds, without the pressure of a live audience. What happened that morning was anything but routine. Headlines from sports desks described crowds flocking to Eala's practice session, turning a warm-up into an event. People stood 3 rows deep just to watch training rallies. The atmosphere described by journalists present was more commonly associated with competitive match play than with preparation drills. For a player who was still working on her clay court form and processing a loss in Strasbourg just days earlier, this was a practice session that carried the weight of a performance. This is the moment where the story shifts from numbers, server crashes, resale prices, demand data, into something more human and harder to quantify. Numbers can be explained away. A practice court surrounded by 3 rows of fans who travel to Paris specifically to watch training sessions is a different category of signal entirely. It reframed what attention means in the context of Eala's 2026 Roland Garros presence. Attention in tennis is typically conditional. It follows match results, court assignments, seedings, broadcast scheduling. It responds to institutional direction. What happened at Court 4 suggested something else. that the audience following Eala was operating independently of those conditions. They were there before the match, before the result, before any institutional signal told them to be. WTA player Amanda Anisimova, in a parallel moment that had occurred earlier in Dubai, was seen choosing to watch Eala from the stands during a match, not for scouting purposes, not due to scheduling coincidence, but voluntarily. A current top 10 professional giving up preparation time to observe a peer as a spectator. That is a different kind of validation than rankings or ticket prices provide. It is peer recognition offered without prompting. Both moments, the practice court crowd and Anisimova in the stands, point toward the same conclusion, that Eala's gravitational pull on attention exists independently of what the tournament or broadcast schedules direct people toward. Amanda Anisimova said it without being asked. There is a specific kind of validation that carries more weight than any ranking or award, the kind that comes unprompted from a peer who had no structural reason to offer it.
At an earlier WTA event in Dubai, Amanda Anisimova, currently ranked inside the top 10, was seen watching Eala's match from the stands. She had her own professional schedule and preparation demands. There was no reporting obligation, no organized event that required her presence. She chose, independently, to be there as an observer. That alone was noted by those following Eala's season closely. But it was what Anisimova said afterward that elevated the moment beyond mere attendance. In her own words, "I stuck around for it because the atmosphere was so great." And then, without being asked about cultural symbolism or national representation, she added that Eala is such a good representation of her country, noting she's so young and she carries herself so well. Read that again. A top 10 professional, someone who has played Wimbledon, reached Grand Slam second weeks, competed at the highest levels of the tour, voluntarily became an audience member at a peer's match, and then, without any journalistic prompting, framed that peer in terms of national identity and personal character. No reporter had asked about Filipino representation in tennis. No question had been posed about Eala's maturity or how she carries herself under pressure. Anisimova volunteered all of it. This matters because peer validation in professional sports is rare and carefully guarded. Players competing on the same tour operate in a context where praising a rival carries real competitive implications. The instinct is usually neutrality. What Anisimova offered was something much more specific, an unsolicited character assessment from someone in a position to evaluate it firsthand. When a current top 10 player voluntarily becomes an audience member at your match and independently invokes national representation, it signals a shift beyond rankings into perception, identity, and presence. It says this player's story is already being read as something larger than individual match results. And when that reading comes from within the tour itself, from someone with nothing to gain from saying it, its credibility is categorically different from anything a marketing campaign could produce. The Eala Effect, from Auckland to Paris. The pattern holds. One tournament could be framed as momentum. Two could be a trend. What has accumulated around Eala across the 2025-2026 season goes well beyond either category. It is a pattern that has repeated across surfaces, time zones, and competitive contexts with enough consistency that it has earned its own name. One broadcast segment labeled it the Eala Effect, a phrase meant to capture what data and observation were increasingly aligning on. Attention clustering wherever she plays, independent of court assignment, seeding, or broadcast priority. The geographic range of this pattern is striking. Auckland, the Australian Open, where Court 6 reportedly overflowed and drew media analysis about whether Grand Slams need to rethink court allocation for players generating her level of crowd pressure. Abu Dhabi, Doha, Dubai, Indian Wells. At each stop, the same dynamic repeated. Crowds gravitating toward her matches, attendance patterns shifting in her direction. A level of ambient attention that tournament structures hadn't built models to accommodate. At Stuttgart's Porsche Grand Prix, attendance patterns reportedly shifted once she entered the main draw.
and Stuttgart is a clay court event in Europe, not a market typically associated with Southeast Asian sports consumption. That matters. It demonstrates that the effect is not geographically contained or culturally isolated to Filipino diaspora communities.
It has extended into European tennis centers, where her fan base has less physical presence, but where the pattern repeated regardless. What makes the Eala effect analytically significant, rather than just emotionally compelling, is precisely this. It has not been surface-dependent, location-specific, or tied to a single breakout moment. It has followed a consistent directional pattern across varied conditions. When a phenomenon repeats that consistently across that range of variables, the word coincidence stops being useful. At Roland Garros, the trajectory reached its loudest expression yet. A clay court Grand Slam in Paris, where anticipation had outgrown the normal architecture of scheduling, broadcasting, and even ticket allocation. For those who had followed closely since the early stages, before mainstream coverage fully aligned with it, this moment felt less like discovery and more like confirmation of something that had been building in plain sight. Rafael Nadal chose her, and now she returns to his court. In November 2024, Rafael Nadal officially retired from professional tennis after 14 Roland Garros titles, the most dominant clay court legacy the sport has ever seen. His retirement marked the end of an era at the tournament that had defined his career. But months later, he returned to competitive practice at his academy in Monacar, Spain, for his first hitting session after retirement. He chose Eala. Not a top-ranked player, not a Grand Slam champion, not a marquee name from the current top 10. A 20-year-old developing player from the Philippines who trains within the Rafa Nadal Academy system. That was his selection for the first meaningful practice of his post-retirement return to tennis. In her interview with The National, Eala described the moment with visible disbelief. "It was crazy. It was my first time ever hitting with him, and I was so nervous. It was just such a great experience to really absorb all that knowledge." She added that simply being on court with him felt insane and that she felt so lucky and so blessed. The quote is genuine, but the significance lies less in her words than in the structure of the moment itself. Nadal is not an athlete who makes performative choices for publicity. His post-retirement return to the court, his first meaningful practice, is a deliberate act, and he directed that act toward Eala. In a sport where symbolic gestures are rare and carefully guarded, actions like this are often interpreted as their own kind of endorsement. Now she returns to Roland Garros, the tournament that defined his legacy more than any other venue in tennis history, as a seeded player. Secondary markets are pricing her appearances at four-figure levels. 500,000 people crashed the ticketing system before the draw was released. A 14-time champion on this surface chose her as his first hitting partner after retirement. Whether framed as coincidence or trajectory, the contrast is stark enough to stop being dismissible. A player once chosen for a private practice session with the most dominant clay court figure in history is now generating demand pressures that spill into ticketing systems, resale markets, and scheduling debates at the same venue where that figure built his legend. What happens next, and why the sport can't look away? What is unfolding at Roland Garros 2026 is not a single tournament story. It is a collision point, the moment where a sustained pattern of attention, a structural shift in global sports consumption, and an individual player's rising competitive ceiling all arrive at the same venue simultaneously. The question being asked now is not whether Eala is generating extraordinary attention. That question was answered by the server crash, by the $2,000 resale prices, by the 3 rows of fans at Court 4, by Amanda Anisimova choosing to stay and watch. All of those data points are in the public record. The question that remains open is institutional. How does professional tennis respond when audience gravity begins behaving like a primary force rather than a byproduct of competition? The debate has already been framed explicitly.
If Eala reaches the quarterfinals and faces defending champion Coco Gauff on court Philippe Chatrier, should Roland Garros be obligated, operationally or morally, to place that match on the main stadium court regardless of traditional seeding and scheduling logic? Or does the tournament remain bound strictly to established protocol even as the demand curve points clearly elsewhere? It is no longer just a tennis question. It is a question about how institutions respond when audience gravity outpaces formal structure. And the secondary market has already answered part of it. Brokers recognized her commercial pull and priced accordingly, long before any official acknowledgement arrived. Meanwhile, Eala herself remains grounded in the process. Her own words on arriving in Paris: "I'm finding my footing. I'm a much better player physically and mentally than I was last year. And hopefully the things we've been working on will reflect more on my game." No deflection, no performance of confidence, just a steady awareness that the work is still incomplete, and a commitment to showing up the next morning regardless of the noise surrounding her. That accountability, at 20 years old, under this level of attention, is part of the story too. Every packed practice court, every overflowed gallery, every tournament director quietly recalculating crowd capacity. This moment feels less like an exception and more like a destination that was building long before Paris formally acknowledged it. If you want to follow every match, every court decision, and every shift in the narrative as it develops, this is the channel that covers it without shortcuts. Subscribe to Pro Tennis 360 and stay with the story that professional tennis is still learning how to explain.